така виїзна американська political science session продовжується. І наш другий на сьогоднішній день спікер Майкл Отен Порівняльна. Він є лейтенантом корпусу морської піхоти Сполучених Штатів Америки. В Києві перебуває в рамках програми імені Фулбрайта. І от його презентація, бачите, присвячена проблематиці сепаратизму і імперіалізму на прикладі російської політики і російського впливу на такі країни, як Україна та Грузія.
Я прошу прощения сначала, что мой уровень русского или украинского недостаточно высокий, чтобы выступить только на русском. Если вам что-то непонятно, задайте вопросы, мы сможем вместе обсудить.
Ну, говоришь уже отлично.
Спасибо. Great. Well, thank you guys for coming. Like I said, if there's anything that you didn't get, or if you have any questions in the middle of my presentation, feel free to just raise your hand, and we'll talk about it. So I'm Second Lieutenant Майкл Отен. I'm in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I spent some time in Georgia at their military academy, and here I'm actually studying business and finance, not war. But however, I'm kind of just naturally interested in this kind of thing. So I did some research on my own, and I hope you guys find it interesting. Next slide, please. So the slide, or the plan of today, I just want to kind of give you a history of the Georgian conflict, and kind of an analysis of similarities and differences between the Georgian one and the Ukrainian one. And kind of the purpose of this is to make a comparative perspective between Ukraine and Georgia. The situations in Ukraine and Georgia are kind of cognitively similar in a lot of ways. You could make the argument that before the 2008 war in Georgia, Georgia also had its own auto in a way, and then in 2008 the war became hot, with people with Georgian flags on their shoulders and people with Russian flags on their shoulders actually fighting each other in open war. And that's obviously not the situation that any of us want in Ukraine. So I think it's kind of helpful to look at this, look at the Georgian conflict and see if there's any lessons that can be drawn from it. And even though maybe none of us are in a position to kind of make a difference, it helps to become more informed voters and kind of just learn more about the situation. So that's kind of the purpose of the lecture today. So next slide. So you guys probably already know a lot about Georgia, but just kind of some basic things about it. There's 3 breakaway regions in Georgia. You have Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Adjarka. Throughout Georgian history, the Georgian Empire used to stretch all the way around the Black Sea, and it's been the most powerful nation in the Caucasus Mountains for most of its history as well. One critical piece of one critical piece of geography here is right there is the Roki Tunnel, and that is the primary thoroughfare between Russia and South Ossetia. And that was a critical piece of geography during the war, as we'll see later. Next slide. So this is kind of how it all started. On the night of August 7th, 2008, Saakashvili was on the phone talking to his commanders in the field, and he ordered a artillery strike on a Russian column that was coming through the Roki Tunnel. And then he put down the phone and he turned over to his advisors, and he said, "It has started. Do you think we will end up as Israelis or Palestinians?" So that's where it ended up. So let's figure out how we got to that point. Next slide. So the background of kind of this whole conflict is that Georgia had a lot of conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in its past. A lot of bad blood between ethnic Abkhazians and ethnic South Ossetians. There were claims of ethnic violence made by Russia against Georgia, claims made by Georgia against Russia, by Georgia against the Abkhazians, and it was a very complicated conflict. Most of the claims of kind of ethnic cleansing, or the worst of the claims on the Russian side, were later disproven by the Tagliavini report, which was done by the European Union following the war. However, Georgia did do some bad things in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Specifically in Abkhazia, they destroyed some Abkhazian national treasures. There was a big Abkhazian national statue that was destroyed by the Georgians in the 1990s. And so that's kind of the background of it, is there's a lot of bad blood historically. And that's kind of been happening since 1991. So that was easy for Russia to kind of exploit in the escalation to war later. Next slide. Another critical piece of background is the early years of Putin's rule over Russia. And this is kind of a very interesting quote. This is President Putin in 2002 at the NATO summit. Putin says, "Ukraine is an independent sovereign state and will choose its own path to peace and security. Such a conversation between Ukraine and NATO would be entirely appropriate and possible. I certainly don't see there being anything particularly tricky here or anything that could cast a shadow over relations between Russia and Ukraine." So that's obviously very different than Putin's current position. So how did they get so bad in the meantime? Next slide. One of the issues is obviously NATO enlargement. So this is kind of one of Putin's biggest critiques of the West. Is that NATO is continuously enlarging, threatening Russia and coming up right on its borders. Another interesting quote though is that in 2002, in this kind of general atmosphere of peace and cooperation, George Bush himself said the NATO-Russia Council offers Russia a path to forming an alliance with the alliance. So it's interesting to see that in 2002, there was this idea in Washington, in the American government, that NATO and Russia could work together and maybe form a type of alliance with each other. I couldn't imagine anybody saying that today. But NATO enlargement has always been controversial. And in 2004, there were some critical NATO acquisitions, most notably the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And those acquisitions directly coincided with the change in the Russian tone towards this whole NATO thing. And also, you can see that a lot of these kind of quotes of kind of peace and cooperation were before 2003. And obviously in 2003, one major geopolitical event was America's invasion of Iraq, which Russia and Ukraine both criticized extensively. And that was kind of a big break in the Russian perception of the United States. Next slide. The next thing that changed was also in 2004. In addition to acquiring the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, there were also some color revolutions, which you guys know all about. The one major difference I'll highlight here is that it seems like the difference between the Rose Revolution and the Orange Revolution was that the Rose Revolution was explicitly anti-Russian, and the Orange Revolution didn't have the same degree of purely anti-Russian tone. It was kind of a centerpiece of Saakashvili's movement, was to, as you can see here, stop Russia. And that wasn't exactly present in the Orange Revolution. Next slide. And then another critical component is the Kosovo precedent, is what Russia calls it, is the Kosovo precedent. This one's really important because this one happened in 2008, in February 2008. And then after February of 2008, Russia began escalating in Georgia, and then just a couple of months later, there was full-out war. Essentially, there's some really interesting comparisons between Kosovo and Georgia. One is that the Russian military studied NATO's battle plan in Kosovo and kind of copied it, kind of word for word, in the Caucasus. So there's a couple of very interesting similarities, such as the general escalation, then providing arms, then installing political leaders that are, friendly to the regime, and then after that, it just kind of naturally escalates into war. So that's an easy thing for Russia to fall back on, is, hey, you did this in Kosovo, so we did it in the Caucasus. And I think this kind of all goes into the background of Putin in 2005. Kind of a famous quote was that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And maybe kind of what Putin was thinking during this time was that he didn't want to end up like Gorbachev, right? He didn't want to give too much freedom, he didn't want to give too much leeway to his kind of parent states with Ukraine and Georgia, and then ends up having them completely losing them from his sphere of control. So then he starts going back on his original promises. Next slide. This is an interesting one because it's something that's been discussed in Ukraine extensively, is to what extent should there be a NATO military presence on the ground. NATO's actually been training in Georgia since 2004, since Saakashvili took power, and there were some interesting effects of that. I think that people who are very kind of pro-Ukrainian want to have a tighter alliance with NATO and Ukraine, which would be good for certain respects. But for Georgia, it was good and it was bad. It was bad because the training that they were doing with the Georgians was training for counterinsurgency warfare. And then when the war kicked off in 2008, it was full-blown warfare, right? It was a completely different type of warfare. They were training the Georgians to, live amongst the Afghanis and the Iraqis and kind of connect with them and build their roads, build their schools, act as investigators maybe, act as police. And so when war kicked off in 2008 in Georgia, the Georgian military wasn't trained for that type of warfare. They were no longer trained for full-scale maneuver warfare, where there's tanks and there's planes and there's boats and it's all together. Another negative effect of the NATO-Georgian connection was that actually when war kicked off in Georgia in 2008, Georgia's best infantry brigade, the 1st Brigade, was physically in Afghanistan. So that was about 30% of Georgia's entire military was off in another country fighting NATO, helping out NATO with Afghanistan. Once the war kicked off, U.S. planes flew these guys back to Georgia, but they were there after August 12th, which was the end of hostilities in Georgia. So they did not participate in the war. So they were Georgia was a little bit undermanned and not specifically trained for the conflicts that they found themselves in 2008. Next slide. Another kind of interesting escalation is that leading up to 2008, specifically following the NATO recognition of Kosovo in February, Russia began handing out passports to its citizens in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which it then later used as a justification for its military intervention there. So that's something that's been happening in Ukraine, in Crimea, and in Donbass as well. So it's an interesting comparison. It's kind of a similar battle plan on Russia's side. Next slide. The NATO Bucharest summit was one of the like final turning points in Russia's perception of the West. During the NATO Bucharest summit, there was a big kind of discussion on the part of NATO as to what to say about Ukraine and Georgia. George W. Bush was still the president at the time, and George W. Bush really liked Georgia, and he wanted to say that that will include Georgia in NATO in this thing called the Membership Action Plan. But however, Merkel, representing Germany and France as well, didn't want to include Georgia and Ukraine that quickly into the NATO process because they saw the problems that would create with Russia. And so they talked and they went back and forth for days and days, and what they came out with was a promise, and the promise went like this: one day Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. So that was essentially kind of a bad compromise, because not only did Ukraine and Georgia, they didn't get any benefits of further connection with NATO, and it also angered Russia, because now Russia sees this as a direct threat to its interests. And Putin was at the summit, and on April 4th, there was a press conference Putin shows up like 3 hours late, clearly not very happy with the results of the summit. And then he says this. Putin says, "Ukraine is an artificial creation and a state whose final formation is not complete." So that's a little bit different than what he said in 2002, right? So this is kind of how this all happens. And following Bucharest, things started to get really bad in Georgia. Next slide. So escalation. In April, right after the Bucharest summit, direct legal ties were established with the separatist regions, essentially putting Russian embassies in South Ossetia and Abkhazia on sovereign Georgian land. Russia shot down an unmanned aerial vehicle that was operated by the Georgians, and they quickly began the construction of a military-grade railroad to Abkhazia. They started building up their forces, and kind of one of the most critical things was these exercises called Kavkaz 2008, which were by the Russian forces, and they were fictional exercises to prepare for the annexation or to prepare for the defense of the local population against a foreign power. So like very poorly concealed practice for the war in Georgia. And after Kavkaz 2008, just 2 days later, they were in war. And then another critical thing during this escalation phase was that during the escalation, the EU and OSCE had permitted Russia full control of the peacekeeping forces in Georgia. So there were no international monitors or no international peacekeepers that were there to kind of watch the situation. So during escalation, there was no way of knowing exactly what was happening, and Russia didn't allow any peacekeepers. And that's a critical difference, which works in Ukraine's favor with the current conflict in Ukraine. Next slide. So it has begun. Russia installed a strongman in Tishkin-Vali, which is the capital of South Ossetia. At the last minute, Georgia sent an urgent diplomatic mission to Moscow to try to ease tensions. They wrote a memo that was going to essentially give South Ossetia and Abkhazia a little more independence, which was then leaked to the press in Moscow by somebody, nobody knows who, and then after that there was essentially no hope of a diplomatic resolution. And kind of what was going on in Saakashvili's mind, so a lot of people blame Saakashvili for starting this war. They say that he acted too aggressively. When the Russians started coming through the Roki tunnel, he shouldn't have ordered that military strike. However, one interesting kind of point from his perspective is that in the Georgian national memory, a lot of Georgians remembered the Bolshevik Revolution, and a lot of Georgians regretted not fighting for their independence in the Bolshevik Revolution. And Saakashvili felt that if he didn't order a strike, that he was going to get out of power anyways, that he was going to be overthrown, and he felt that he had to actually order the strike in order to stay the president of Georgia. Next slide. Okay, and then kind of another thing that Russia did was massive, disinformation campaign, which we know Russia's really good at. So this is the site of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia, and that's obviously Saakashvili, and that's obviously Hitler. So they hacked his site and put in these pictures, and it was part of the entire war effort. Was the on-the-ground conflict plus the hackers together. It was a multi-pronged war. Next slide. Okay, so let's get to the similarities, of which there are kind of few, and the differences are kind of a lot more interesting, and there's a lot more of them. So similarities is kind of like, there's the basic shared history, obviously very different countries, but the basic shared history of, being part of the Soviet Union. There's kind of the geographical reality of being, close to Russia. And I think another critical similarity is that from the Western perspective, Georgia and Ukraine kind of moved together. which you can see now with the visa-free regime establishment. Georgia's kind of been going for this since 2004 when Saakashvili first came, and Ukraine's been, pushing for this more aggressively, since, before, but, mainly since 2014, and they both established them together. So from Western eyes, from the EU, from the OSCE perspective, Ukraine and Georgia are kind of seen as part of a whole. Next slide. All right, critical differences. One critical difference is that Georgia has had a much higher military contribution to the West, which didn't actually really help Georgia, as we'll see. But Georgia actually, of all the countries that have participated in the war on terror, which is Iraq and Afghanistan together, Georgia is the country that has contributed the most soldiers per capita. So Georgia has contributed more soldiers per capita than America, than Britain, than Australia, than Poland, than any of our close allies, which is insane when you think about that. And what did Georgia get as a result of all that sacrifice in Afghanistan? Ukraine, on the other hand, participated in Iraq for a few months until there was a terrible tragedy in Iraq where some Ukrainian soldiers were killed when an ammunition depot exploded, and then Ukraine pulled out its troops and didn't participate in Iraq or Afghanistan. That kind of goes to general public perception in Georgia was kind of like for Iraq, and I think maybe Georgia was probably the only country in the world that kind of stood with America in the Iraq War. And Ukraine has obviously had a very different perspective towards the Iraq War, as I'm sure you all know. Another critical difference is kind of international exposure. When the war kicked off in Georgia in 2008, the commander of NATO in Europe was on vacation, actually, and he didn't even bother to end his vacation. He was in, I don't know, Malta or Sicily or something with his family, and he probably had a call or two, but he stayed on vacation. And when everything happened in Ukraine, there was a lot more international exposure than as opposed to when it happened in Georgia. With general media, kind of general overall exposure to Ukraine was much higher, which is obviously working to Ukraine's favor. And then this is kind of an interesting one. The last one here is kind of the closeness to the Slavic world or whatever. And I don't know what to really make of that, but according to one author, I'll read this quote from one author. Is driven by perceptions of shared history, religion, and culture. Much of the Russian elite is incapable of thinking about Ukraine other than as a client state. And they draw upon the shared experience of Kiev and Rus and the shared Slavic identity with that regard. So that makes Russians kind of feel closer to Ukraine than to Georgia. Georgians are Caucasian people, Ukrainians are Slavic people, and that kind of that makes Russia feel like they kind of own Ukraine, in the opinion of that author. Next slide.
And who's that author?
I'll get it to you. I'm not sure. I think it's on my notes slide at the end. Okay, critical differences too. In Georgia, there was a long and bloody history of ethnic conflict in the separatist provinces in Abkhazia and South Ossetia that a lot of people blame Georgia for treating them poorly. Russia claimed it was genocide. In Ukraine, that just does not exist. There's no objective justification for saying that the Ukrainians are oppressing the people in the Donbass or Crimea. There's not 20 years of conflict there, so it's a harder sell from Russia's perspective. Another critical difference is the longevity of the reform effort. Georgia since 2004 has been very pro-Western, very anti-Russian, and in Ukraine that hasn't really been present, in like a large scale until 2014. And then the last one, and I think this one is very interesting and critical for Ukraine, is blame for the war. So many people, even in the West, kind of agreed with the Russian line that Saakashvili was the one who started the war in 2008. Ukraine has no such politician, no single person on the Ukrainian side who can be blamed. Which, from the Ukrainian perspective, you know, some people might think that's kind of bad, or, you know, there should have been a stronger response. But from the Western perspective, like, it's obvious. Like, there's no way anybody can make an argument that Ukraine started this conflict. And that's really working in Ukraine's favor from a Western perspective. There were a lot of people in the West, particularly Germany, France, who did not want to come to Saakashvili's aid because they thought he was kind of a crazy man, kind of a warmonger, and that he wanted this war from the beginning. Nobody can say that about Ukraine. Next slide. I think kind of the way forward, in both cases, I think that, you know, Russia's tactical aims were achieved, but their strategic aims were not achieved. So Ukraine, or, you know, in both Ukraine and Georgia, Russia, you know, specifically in Georgia, Russia got more territory, right? So that's their tactical aims, their small-scale aims. However, their large-scale aims, which was kind of the overthrow of a pro-Western regime and the, like, re-establishment of Georgia within their sphere of influence, was not achieved in Georgia. Despite the fact that they lost South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Georgia continued west. And I think the same could be said for Ukraine. And here's another interesting quote, same author, I'll get you the author. This kind of goes to Russia's failure to achieve its strategic aims, is from one author. Although only a minority of Ukraine's population was anti-Russian before the crisis, Moscow's resort to war has created a genuine sense of nationhood in parts of that country where previously it had been weak. So the fact that Moscow resorted to war, to open conflict, probably isn't going to work out in the long run in Ukraine, according to this author. And yeah, so kind of the way forward is that, you know, one thing that did work in Saakashvili's favor is that he did want to reach out to the minorities in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And as a result, there was actually someone who nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, which might seem a little bit ridiculous. But the fact that there were people who kind of saw Saakashvili as kind of like a peace, you know, loving person who was willing to make concessions towards the regions and, you know, do whatever it takes for peace, was critical. And that's kind of that's what the next president of Ukraine should be. And then you know, obviously the main thing, you know, for Ukraine from a Western perspective, you know, speaking as a foreigner, is just, you know, to focus on, you know, internal development and corruption, you know, become you know, the democracy, the reform tiger that it would need to kind of get support of the West. And I think, generally speaking, you know, this is something that they taught us at West Point, and something that, you know, I've kind of learned from my military background, is that the war of ideas is the most important war of all, right? It doesn't matter, you know, what you do on the ground, but if you can convince people that your side is right and good and good for them, then that's the most important thing that you can do. So, which means, you know, not doing anything bad. You know, do no harm. Do no harm. First rule of a counterinsurgency conflict is do no harm. You know, no better friend, no worse enemy. It's kind of what they taught us. So yeah, so that's kind of that's my presentation. I'd be glad to take any questions or comments or any disagreements or whatever. I'd like to look forward to some discussion on this. So thank you.
Thank you. You know, I like the most the conclusion that the war of ideas is the most important of all.
Yeah.
It's got to be the motto of our department.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Keep the war of ideas going.
Yeah. Yeah. There's that's something that it's hard to convince governments right? That the war of ideas is most important because it's obvious from the government's perspective. But one thing that I think America has done is pretty interesting is that in the war against terror, so in the US State Department, there's a cell of like 20 people who are native Arabic speakers, and their job is to go onto the internet and argue with like ISIS, right? So their job is to essentially, they are the front line in the war of ideas, which is the most important thing. So they go on there, they try to convince people not to join ISIS. You know, they have Twitter bots, right? They go on the Twitter and all that stuff. So
they didn't know that.
yeah, it's pretty cool, pretty cool.
But do you think that there is any chance for Georgia to win these territories back, given that the long history of bad blood, ethnic conflict, and full-scale war, in fact?
Right. I do not.
Especially with regard to Abkhazia, because I'm not an expert on the region, but as far as I know, Abkhazians have a very distinct identity, both ethnic and, well, kind of linguistic one.
Right.
Culturally, they're entirely different from Georgians, right?
Right.
So do you think kind of it's tangible to hope that they will be brought back somehow?
I personally do not. I've been to Gori, Georgia, which is right on the border with South Ossetia. That's where the Georgian Military Academy is, and I was there for a visit. And from the town in Gori, I saw the Russian bases across the border. So, you know, at night in Georgia, there's not a lot of electricity, except for there's these pockets of very bright light, which are all Russian bases. So you're right there on the interstate, and you look off to the north to the mountains, and you see Russian base, Russian base, Russian base. And the strength that, you know, Georgia's, no, unless there's a drastic regime change in Russia, there's no way Georgia will ever get those territories back, in my opinion. Yeah, Georgia's kind of military spirit was kind of broken with the conflict. I mean, they feared a total takeover of Tbilisi. The government went into exile, you know. So, yeah, the Russian generals were on the road getting ready to move to Tbilisi, and the government left Tbilisi and went into hiding. So it's like,
so what's your take on, actually, I think it's an important question
Yeah.
that gives you insights on a lot of other things. Why didn't they go all the way to Tbilisi?
yeah,
Right, because the trope was
Right.
set up, you know, this is a Georgian aggression.
Right.
Saakashvili is like Hitler. So
Right.
we do what we did in World War II, we go all the way to Berlin, or in this case, we go all the way to Tbilisi.
Yeah.
And they stop 20 miles short.
that's right.
What's your take
Okay,
on
so
it?
my take on it is that, well, it almost happened. Like, from what I've read, the Russian generals were actually telling the media. So the commander on the ground, the Russian commander on the ground, was telling the media, we're getting ready to move to Tbilisi, like with his tanks and everything. And I think they would have. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that Medvedev was the president at the time, and not Putin. Maybe it was because of a last-minute diplomatic effort by the United States or by Germany or something. I don't know. You know, maybe it would have been better actually for Russia if they had moved to Tbilisi, because then they would have been able to, you know, complete their strategic goals, which is the overthrow of the Saakashvili regime and the installment of a pro-Russian regime.
So you think external pressure?
I would say it was probably external pressure.
But don't we think that Russia would face a severe backlash from the West
Yeah.
had they taken Tbilisi?
I think they would have, and I think the backlash would have been worse than it was already. One interesting thing about the Georgian conflict is that the sanctions on Russia were lifted just a few months after the conflict ended, despite the fact that Russia had not given back any territory, right? So maybe that was the deal, right? You know, maybe that was the deal, is that, you know, we won't sanction you too badly if you stay away from Tbilisi. That's I think it was probably external pressure. Yeah. Is there?
We are all, of course, interested in Georgia and the history of this Russian-Georgian conflict, but I'd like actually to come back to Ukraine because we are most interested in our country, right? And actually, from your perspective, from perspective of Westerner who is interested in these issues of conflicts and stuff like this, how would you say? What would be the perspective for Ukraine to come back to these territories of eastern Ukraine? Would you see any kind of some creative or some new, some not used before measures which can be taken, some steps can be taken to move this peace process forward, right? To make, because we know, for example, just recently we remember this conflict in Colombia, and we know that this conflict was very long-lasting, more than 50 years. You know, this conflict between governmental forces and this left
FARC, I think.
These rebels, rebels who are in these jungles, And this president, Colombian president, was strong enough, creative and intelligent and ready to make some moves which were not traditionally, which make some, progress in this.
Absolutely.
This relationships. What to do with to Ukraine? Because as we see, our political elites is completely powerless and has no ideas and has no, I think, even to put it frankly, even desires and wishes to end it up.
Yeah, I understand.
What to do? What would you say from Western perspective?
I would say I would kind of draw from American history on this one, actually. So I'm from the South of America, from a small town, and we had a civil war in America, right? The North versus the South, and a lot of my relatives still have a bad feeling towards the Northerners, right? They say, those dang Yankees, they came down and they burned all of our farms and they, killed all of us, and there's still kind of like this North and South rivalry. However, interesting point is that President Lincoln had a plan. It was called the Lincoln Reconstruction Plan, and basically Lincoln's plan was to say, hey, everybody in the South, all you have to do is raise your hand and say an oath of allegiance to the United States, and after that, we'll leave you alone, right? So you just say an oath of allegiance, put down your guns, and you can have your states. We won't institute martial law. We won't burn your farms. We won't, kill anybody. All you have to do is say, I support the United States, put down your arms, and peaceful. And I think back to my family and the way they feel about the North. And I think that if Lincoln would have lived to implement his Reconstruction Plan instead of the later Reconstruction Plan, which was much harsher, I think that there wouldn't be such a bad blood between the North and the South, in my opinion. I think what that would mean for Ukraine's perspective is to, just do, the Lincoln Reconstruction Plan is like, hey, all you have to do is say that I support the government of Ukraine, lay down your arms, and we'll go, and I know that's hard to do, right? I know, like, when people are getting killed and when it's personal, it's hard to do, but, from my perspective, like, I think that there wouldn't be such a continuing conflict between the North and the South if we had made such a peaceful overture from the beginning. So, that's what I'd say. Thank you.
Have you had the chance to deal with Ukrainian military under this Fulbryta stint? And if so, what's your opinion on Ukrainian military shape?
The state of the Ukrainian military? Well, it's kind of from my perspective, it's kind of strange to think how disorganized the Ukrainian military was in 2014. Because I see the military today, and they have new equipment. The military-industrial complex is like the huge manufacturer, even exporter of like military helicopters and like big like industrial capacity to support the military. So it's kind of, I can't really understand why, why from the beginning they were so disorganized. So that's kind of my first observation. My second one is kind of that, maybe the Ukrainian military could be a little bit more disciplined. It's hard to discipline an army in the middle of a war. We had tons of discipline problems in the U.S. Army during the middle of Iraq when it was bad fighting and stuff. I've had minimal interactions with the Ukrainian military, but it kind of seems like the development of like a military culture and like a disciplined military culture is a little bit lagging, in my opinion. Yeah.
So again, ideas matter.
Yeah, exactly. Ideas matter, and then discipline's important.
And by the way, speaking of Ukraine as an expert of arms, well, Ukraine has been doing this for decades, and some analysts say that it's part of the problem because Ukraine sells most of advanced weapons it produces overseas, thus stripping its own armed forces of this new equipment and weapons. Because unfortunately it's more lucrative to sell it overseas, let's say India, Pakistan, for hard currencies than supply to Ukrainian armed forces. And therefore, Indian armed forces have a better chance of getting the most advanced tanks manufactured in Ukraine than Ukrainian armed forces.
Yeah. So then the question is, does Ukraine need Western arms? Or can they? Maybe it's just.
It does because there are huge discrepancies in manufacturing weapons and ammo. For example, as far as I know, I think it was either there was no or there is only one facility manufacturing ammos, and it's either beyond outside of Ukraine or it's on territories which are not controlled by Ukraine. So Ukraine basically has to buy ammo for rifles because you cannot manufacture it. As far as I know, I'm not an expert, but this is what I've read in media reports.
Interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.